This video may come as a bit of a surprise because I did a terrible job predicting the books that I was going to run to read this winter. So if you're here hoping for a review of a specific book and it's not in this video, I'm sorry. But this is a review of the books I read over the winter. The first book I read, and this is one that I said I would read, was Katabasis by R.F. Kuang. This book is about two graduate students who journey into hell to try to bring back their advisor. They are graduate students at Cambridge, but studying magic. So this book is set in a sort of nearby world to ours, but not quite our world. And their professor basically is a huge jerk, but he's very prestigious. And they really need his recommendations in order to be able to get positions, teaching positions, once they finish their program. And most of the book is told through the perspective of Alice, but the other graduate student, Peter, there are a few chapters that are also told from his perspective. And the book basically traces their journey down through the levels of hell. So it's in some ways a bit of a take on Dante's Inferno. You go through what each of the various levels are and you talk to the people there and get a sense of the kind of suffering that they're going through and the way that their particular set of sins led to that suffering. And it is also a story about the relationship, a love story about the relationship between these two characters who are academic rivals and, have a lot of reasons to be sort of suspicious of each other or in competition with each other, and yet really get on and really enjoy each other's company, but start the book at a place where the sort of competitive academic world that they're in has driven a wedge between the relationship. And so you have to watch the relationship sort of heal over the course of the book. And also, you get to just have a fun little jaunt through hell. I quite enjoyed this book. What I would say about it is kind of what I would say about most of R.F. Kuang's works, which is the first 3/4 are amazing, 2/3 to 3/4 are amazing, and then I just don't like the way she ends her books. I always find it sort of disappointing. And the ending of this book I also found quite disappointing. I won't spoil the details, but the way that it ends is a little bit of a sort of deus ex machina. A random character sort of pops up and saves the day, and it doesn't really feel like the characters have earned the ending that they get. It's in some ways not a terribly unexpected ending. You have a love story and you can kind of imagine the way that it's going to go, but I just felt like the way the fantasy arc of it all, their journey into hell, and then they have to try to get bring their professor back to life and figure out how they're going to get themselves out of hell. All of that resolved in ways that just felt a little bit convenient. That said, I didn't mind it as much in this book as I did in for instance, Babel. Babel is a book that I think the first 2/3 of it are maybe among the best 2/3 of a book I've ever read. And then the last third I really, really didn't like. And this book, I felt like the first 2/3 were not as cool as Babel. Like the magic system in this book is built on sort of finding philosophical paradoxes, and it is a very cool magical system. I think one thing R.F. Kuang really excels at is coming up with really amazing magical systems and finding places in our world where there are little bits of sort of unknown and ambiguity and the surreal, and mining that for a magical system. So in Babel, it was the ambiguity in translations of words between languages, and the sort of slippage in the translations was where the magic came from. Absolutely amazing. And in this book, the magic comes from, paradoxes, basically, philosophical or mathematical paradoxes. So, for example, like one really famous mathematical paradox is like, if you have someone chasing a turtle, to get to the turtle first, they will have to cover half the distance of the way to the turtle, and then half of the remaining distance, and then half of the remaining distance, and half of the remaining distance. And if you keep just cutting the distance in half, they'll never actually make it to the turtle. right? Of course, obviously in real life, we know that that's not true, but that's an example of the kind of thing. And so then that, using that paradox, someone might be able to create a magic spell that prevents someone from being able to move because they're stuck in place because they can only ever cross half the distance to the next, from point A to B. And super, super cool magic system. And I think because this book felt a little bit more like the point of the book was just exploring the idea of hell that she'd created and the way that, people experience what hell is. So, one of the early levels of hell, for instance, is pride, and the people who are stuck in there are basically stuck in this giant library trying to write the perfect thesis. And it's like a little bit of the perfect becomes the enemy of the good kind of situation where, because they're so prideful, they only want the work if it's really perfect and the best of the best. They aren't able to, they're stuck because they obviously are never going to be able to produce the perfect thesis. And so then they're just stuck in this endless cycle of like stressing and working about this thesis and feeling inadequate. And, and that's pride. That's the like level of pride. And because this book is really about hanging out on those various different levels of hell and just going through hell and sort of experiencing all of the various creatures and punishments that are there, I didn't mind as much that the story arc didn't work that well. Whereas in Babel, the fact that the ending fell flat was really heartbreaking because I was so invested in the story and there was a lot of urgency and momentum I felt in Babel. And so it was really disappointing when it fell flat. Whereas this one, I got a lot out of just existing in the first 2/3 of this book. And so when the ending was a little bit convenient and a little bit pat, it didn't bother me too much. I would say overall, maybe I would give this book like a 7.5 out of 10. Maybe an 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed the super nerdy philosophical musings of the characters, and I liked the very classic two nerds fall in love kind of, romantic B-plot. So yeah, 8 out of 10. Then the next two books that I read are not ones that I have told you I was going to read, but they are The Thursday Murder Club and The Man Who Died Twice by Richard Osman. I am slowly working my way through this series. I have 2 more books to go, and I'm taking a little bit of a break. I took a little bit of a break after these 2. They're pretty good standalone stories, so it's not like you get to the end of one and it's a major cliffhanger and you have to start the next one. They wrap up pretty neatly, but I absolutely loved these books. I don't read mysteries, hardly ever at all. I find that they tend to just be kind of boring and predictable. So much of the plot of a mystery novel is, someone dies or someone disappears or something happens, and then you have to solve the mystery, and there are a couple of red herrings and misdirects, and you think it's this person, and then it's not, and then you solve it, and that's the plot. And I think you have, for me at least, an author has to do a really good job of making the world and the characters so compelling and so fun to be around that I don't mind the fact that the plot is going to inevitably be kind of boring and predictable. And Richard Osman 100% absolutely does it. These are books about pensioners in the UK living in a retirement village. And they're really interesting characters because I think society tends to stereotype people, older people as not being very useful or not being very up on technology and not being very good at navigating the world. And in some ways, these characters really play into those stereotypes. They have a very limited understanding and very limited interest in understanding the internet and social media and, modern technology. They carry cash in their handbag and they take the bus places, and it's really delightful. But also, they're an ex-spy and a nurse and a psychiatrist, and they have this incredible set of skills that they bring from their, long lives to solving these murders. So the first one is about the murder of someone who is developing the retirement community where they live. And it doesn't feel too contrived the way that the gang get drawn into this murder. They have a little club in the retirement community where they solve cold cases just internally for their own fun. One of the gang used to be a retired police officer. And so they had access to some of these old case files, maybe not really supposed to, but they did. And they just like to solve these mysteries sort of for fun, for their own entertainment. And then when someone that they know dies, they take that as the opportunity to try to solve this real life murder. And you can see how someone related to this industry, you know, this sort of development industry, who maybe has some sketchy ties to other kinds of businesses and maybe has a secretive past, could be murdered. And you could see how this group of nosy busybodies might butt their way into solving the murder. And so it doesn't feel like some murder novels do, where they just had to really stretch to try to figure out a way to get the people that you want to be solving the murder actually solving the murder. And I thought the second book also did a really good job of that. You know, I'm a little worried going into the third and fourth, we'll see. I was a little worried going into the second though, and didn't need to be, that it was going to start feeling sort of insane that this little group of people are coming into contact with so many murders all the time. And in the first book, it felt very natural because it was just the murder of someone nearby in the community, and they, you know, sort of butted their way in. And then in the second book, the murder is someone that the characters know, or that one of the characters knows, but that character has a bit of a mysterious past, and so it's not out of the realm of possibility that she would know someone who was going to get murdered. And yeah, and I just felt like both of the books did a good job of making it feel, obviously they're ridiculous and silly, but they didn't feel totally contrived in the way that I think sometimes murders, and particularly murder series, can start to feel. So I will be very curious as I continue reading whether, you know, Osman is able to keep that up. But overall, I really, really enjoyed these books. All of the different characters have such unique personalities. Even though it's, you know, an ensemble cast, you have a clear vision of who each of these characters are and what their various strengths and weaknesses are. And they're all incredibly likable despite their many foibles. And there's a lot of comedy to be found in their interactions with the wider world, and, you know, the fact that they are these very elderly people who are set in their ways and are just determined that they're going to do things their way, even if the world disagrees about how things ought to be done these days. And that's just a lot of fun. So I would probably give these books 8.5 out of 10. I probably wouldn't give them as high as a 9 or 10 out of 10, only because I don't feel like they're going to stick with me in a significant way. They are absolutely so fun, but I don't think I'm going to be going back to reread these books over and over in years to come. And I don't think that the lessons of these books are going to stick with me in the back of my head and pop up in random moments of my life, that kind of thing, that's what I really look for, I think, in books that are 9s and 10s. But I really, really enjoyed both of these, and I would say definitely 8.5 out of 10 for both. I didn't really have a preference one to the other. This one I thought was the second one I thought was a little slower getting going, but I really tore through both of them. The next book that I read, and this is another one that I did tell you about, is The Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wasteland by Sarah Brooks. I thought this book was okay. It is about a train service that runs through a magical wasteland, basically between Moscow and Beijing. And that geographic region has become this dangerous magical wasteland. And the Chinese have built a big wall, and the Russians have built a big wall, and no one's allowed in the middle except for passengers on this train. And the train has iron all over it and reinforced glass, and is built to really withstand all of the dangers of the wasteland. But it's the only way to travel directly across that bit of Asia. And the book takes place over the course of a 3-ish week journey through the Wasteland, and it involves the crew on the train and also some of the passengers. The train has a first class passengers cabin and a third class passengers area, and then also the train is owned by this like giant evil corporation, and so they have inspector guys that work for the company that are also on the train. And the last time the train ran, something happened and some people died and a lot of people lost their memories. And this is the next run of the train. You start just as the train's about to leave and you end basically when it reaches the other side. And no one can remember what happened on that last trip, but everyone knows that it was something bad, and everyone has this sense of foreboding that something could go wrong again. And things start to go wrong. And basically you are with these characters as they, all having their various sets of different incentives, deal with the things that are sort of starting to go wrong. And some of the characters are in denial about the fact that some things are going wrong. Some of the characters are trying to protect everyone. Some of the characters are seizing the opportunity to exploit the things that are going wrong. And it's a very aesthetically beautiful book. And the experience, the sort of mystery, suspense aspect of all these characters being on the train together and uncovering who the various characters are and what their real motivations are and how they may or may not work together in the end, all of that is really fun. The magic system isn't ever really explained. It sort of, in the end, you get a little bit of kind of an explanation of what the magic system is and how it's being corrupted, but it's pretty thin. And I was disappointed by that because everything about the train and the way it works is so well described in such detail and so well thought through. It has this beautiful illustration in the front cover of the train and all the various different cars. So, that's where they hold the water and the service car and the cruise mess and the third class dining and first class dining and the observation room. And it's all extremely well thought through. And so I was really hoping the magic system would also be well thought through. And it just felt like she had this idea for these people on the train and then sort of at the end threw something together to explain why things were falling apart. And that was a bit disappointing given that you spend so much of the book trying to figure out what's gone wrong. For the end, it to just be this sort of vague, mushy thing was disappointing. And I also felt like because the explanation for what was going wrong and the explanation for the magic system didn't really make sense, the ending, the resolution of the plot also didn't really make sense. Some of the character arcs get decent resolutions, but the kind of overall plot resolution was, again, just vague and kind of mushy. Yeah, I would maybe give this book like a 7 out of 10. It wasn't bad, but it didn't really go anywhere. Okay, the last book that I read is not one that I told you about. And this book is a little bit exciting for me because the author reached out and asked if she could send me a free copy. And I occasionally have people reach out and ask if they can send me their books, but usually they're not the kind of thing I'm interested in. And this book sounded right up my alley. And so I was really, really excited that that someone was watching my channel and wanted to, send me their book. And I didn't have to review it, but obviously, if I read it, I was going to review it, and I wasn't going to have someone send me a book that I wasn't going to read. So that said, you should probably build into this review a little bit of a sense that I like this author. Her name is Kemi Ashing-Giwa, and she, from my interactions with her, is just a really lovely, nice person. And so I probably have some inherently positive feelings towards this book, but I will try not to let infect my review, but you'll have to sort of evaluate for yourself. That said, I thought this book was quite good. I didn't love it. I think like all of the sort of sci-fi fantasy books that I read this time around, I would put in the category of good, but they didn't blow my mind. This one is a book about a young woman who starts out working as the sort of prisoner of a high-ranking official in this empire, magical empire, that is, I think, a future version of Earth. So there are these magical creatures, sort of godlike creatures, that have been basically redoing Earth over and over, or redoing humanity over and over in a Noah's Ark kind of way. And this is, I believe, a future iteration of Earth. And so it has different flora and different fauna, and the technology is all different, and there's different magic systems, but it's fundamentally recognizable as people on Earth. And they refer to, there'll be like a piece of furniture that they'll describe as being old Earth wood. And I think that means this is taking place in the future of Earth after humanity has sort of destroyed the planet and, the gods have let us sort of start anew. And there's an empire that is taking over all of these different tribes. And the main character starts out as a prisoner from the empire, but early on in the book, she escapes and joins the rebels. And the rest of the book is about her and her group of rebel buddies trying to overturn the empire. And that's really fun. Anything in the dystopian Dune or Gideon the Ninth or Ancillary Justice, overthrowing the empire, and also there's all this weird tech and it's the future and the climate is failing, that kind of thing I think is really fun. And the basic plot of the book I also quite liked. It follows the main character from her escape through her journey to try to join the rebels, and then the early experiences working with the rebels, and then through the sort of final ultimate efforts to overthrow the empire. And there ends up being sort of a second main character whose perspective you also get, which is one of the princes of the empire, who ends up kind of joining up with the rebels, although you have to figure out through the book if he kind of has his own set of incentives or his own thing going on, but they end up working together at least. And one thing that I really liked about this book was that it didn't do a thing that really annoys me in sort of social justice-y books that I discussed in one of my prior videos recently that I will link here, where they set up this fantasy world that is sort of figuratively representing a lot of problems we have in our world. So in this world, there are these giant corporations that own everything, and one of the characters, for instance, runs away to join the rebels because he is trying to get enough money to pay for the medical treatment of someone he loves, and in order to get a loan to pay for the treatment, he agrees to basically a life of indentured servitude, but then there's a delay in actually getting the treatment, and the person dies in the meantime, and then the company won't refund him, and so he can't pay back his loan, and so he's just stuck in this life of indentured servitude because he paid for this medical treatment for someone, and then the medical treatment didn't even come in time. Anyways, so things like that, where there are the rich just exploiting the climate and leaving everybody else to starve, and it resolves those issues. It doesn't try to resolve those issues in one final magical battle between the most powerful person in the resistance and the most powerful person in the empire. I think a lot of fantasy books really fall into this trap. I think Mistborn kind of falls into this trap. Also, I just read Blood Over Brighthaven, and it ended in a sort of boss battle. And I thought Babel also, one of my biggest problems with the way that book ended is that it tried to resolve social justice problems through a boss battle. And this book doesn't do that. This book takes time to show you the various networks of resistance and all of the different kinds of people in different kinds of roles that are necessary to be able to build resistance, and the way that certain moments can be really pivotal, but, you know, often because they galvanize people. So this book, you know, there are certain moments in this book where things happen, but the reason that those things are important is not the moment itself. It's that the moment becomes really useful for propaganda to galvanize different groups of people to, you know, either join the resistance or oppose the resistance. And I thought this book did a great job of actually feeling like it was building towards the ending in a way that felt sort of true to the way that resistance movements actually built. So I really liked that. I also liked the characters. This book is very casually queer, so a lot of the characters date men or women, and a lot of the characters have sort of flexible genders or haven't yet decided on what their ultimate gender is going to be. And it's just nothing in this society. That's just the way the society works, and no one ever mentions the fact that anyone, you know, is dating someone their gender or a different gender. It's just a complete non-issue. And that's quite fun because it means you never quite know which of the characters are going to end up in which relationships. And I enjoyed that. I think sometimes in books, you can just tell from the minute you meet a character, oh, this character is going to end up romantically linked to that character. And I thought this book did a good job of kind of keeping you guessing. The thing about this book that I didn't like is that I felt like there's just too much in it that doesn't really matter. I think, you know, this book is almost 500 pages long, and I think it could be 350 pages long. The author clearly has so much in her head about the way that this world works, and I really liked that. I like reading a book, you know, where the magic system isn't mushy, where it's very clear that the author has a completely universal, holistic understanding of all of the ways the various bits of magic and tech in this world are interacting. And clearly this author does. But I don't need to know all of it. Like, you don't need to tell me all of it necessarily. And so there are passages where, you know, the characters are seeing some creature, and you're just getting a lot of description about the like dietary habits of this creature. And it just kind of pulls you out of the action. I think if you sort of cut out some of the descriptive passages where nothing's really happening, this book would be, you know, a decent bit shorter, and it would like really fly by in a good way. As it was, I think it took me a while to read it because I would get to a passage where things weren't really happening and then put it down, and then I didn't have that urgency of I have to know what happens next, you know. So there's like a part where the main character has joined the rebellion, and she's sort of musing about her mental health journey, and you see her like learn the rebels like teach her to meditate basically as part of her, you know, honing herself into the most effective weapon and best person she can be, and healing the scars inflicted on her by her upbringing, right? And that's a good thing for them to be doing, but it doesn't come back, you know? It's like a little Chekhov's gun. Like, she does this meditation and then you just never really hear anything else about it. And I didn't need to read a half a page about the main character learning to meditate if that's not gonna have literally anything to do with the rest of the story. And so I think, you know, I really liked everything that was in this book, but there was just too much, like just too many details that I didn't need to know. And it made the book feel slower than I think I would have liked it to be. But that said, you know, I think this book is quite good. I mean, I would probably give this like a 7.5. I think my takeaway is I'm excited to see where this author goes as she, you know, sort of hones her craft and like gets better and better at the, you know, putting the story on paper, because the world building, I also think this author is pursuing a PhD in Earth and Planetary Sciences at Stanford. So it's not that surprising that maybe the author finds all the descriptions of the flora and the fauna more interesting than I do. Like, I wouldn't be pursuing a PhD in planetary sciences. So, you know, so maybe also that's just a preference. But yeah, but I would say this book probably 7.5 out of 10, and I'm really excited to see what this author comes out with next. Okay, so there you have it. These are the 5 books that I read over the winter. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video.